Hi there. Now, I've just got to a stage with this train I'm building where I need to think about installing the hinges. And the hinges I'm going to be using are some hinge points from Robart. Now these are great, they're really well made, they're strong and very little resistance to the movement in them. Now I haven't done any profiling or very little profiling on the wing, and particularly the aileron that I'm going to install the hinges into hasn't been profiled yet. It's just a square piece of timber of the correct size, and that is a deliberate decision. Now I'm not going to be installing the hinges until I've got the wing covered. It's going to be a two-step process. The video of course will be one step, you'll see it right through all the way until it's finished, but for me I'm going to be drilling the holes, making the preparation to install the hinges, then I need to finish the wing, profile the aileron, get it all covered, and then glue the hinges in as a final thing. If I glue the hinges in at this point, then it's going to make covering really difficult. But as I said, for you watching, it'll be a continuous roll through on the video from start to finish. So anyway, I'll move the camera around and we'll have a look at the hinges and the tools I'm going to be using and how I'm going to lay it out and get it done. Right, well these are the hinges I'm going to be using, and they are really well made, very strong, and they're hinged with a steel pin in the centre and they're barbed at the ends. Very little friction, a little bit at the moment, but that eases off with use as well, which is good. But they don't go sloppy. Now these are the hinges that I'm going to be using. That's the packet I've got. These come in packs of 6 or 15. You can also get a hole centering jig, and these are brilliant if you've got a square piece of timber like this, and it just clamps on there to find the center of your piece of timber so you can drill down and you get a nice central hole. You still need to be careful that you line this up and get a square hole, because it will give you a little bit of wiggle in the in that bushing there, but it's easy enough to eye up. Now this centering jig doesn't work quite as well on tapered structures like on this wing. We can see the end of the wing there has got a taper to it, and if we put the jig on, you can get it so it lines up if you're very careful, but I don't really trust it, and it's very easy just to move. It's very difficult to get that nice and square, so I don't use that on tapered structures like this. I'd rather mark it and drill it by eye. Now I'm going to be using a 3mm drill and a 4mm drill with some depth stops, and the 3mm drill will go through the centering jig like that, and I've put a depth stop on it to make sure that when I drill it, I only drill what is necessary for the depth of the hinge itself. I don't over drill it and lose glue at the back of the hole, or if I've got a hollow structure, I drill too far into the structure and the glue just goes straight through. So it's really good to have that depth stop. Where I've got structures like this wing, I've put on blocks, you can see here and here, to allow me to drill a hole, but I don't drill all the way through, and it accommodates the whole of the hinge, and I can drill that, put the glue in, and it's not oozing out through the back, potentially losing most of the glue or dripping onto my covering surface and making a mark. So, but to do that I need to alter the depth stop, because the drill for the wing jig, the depth stop is obviously accounting for that central boss there, which so if I drill that, it goes straight through. So I just need to alter the depth stop when drilling structures like this. Now the 4mm I've got is to counterbore the hole just a few millimeters to allow the hinge to go in correctly, because The hinge itself is 1/8 or just over 3mm, but then it widens out towards the pin to allow the hinge structure there. And you can see by, if I just put it into the hole centering jig, it'll go in that far, but it won't go all the way in because of this broadening out towards the actual hinge point. So by, let me put that back in. So by just counter boring that slightly, it just allows that to fit in nice and snug, but without excess force, which could do some damage, particularly if you're trying to get it out. So that's what we're going to be using, and I will be using my electric drill to drill the holes. So I'll just zoom the camera back out a little bit and I will show you how I'm going to mark up the wing ready to drill, and then we'll get the holes drilled. I've held the aileron up against the wing and the distance is just right here for the aileron to fit in. Oversized on this end because I've still got a wing tip to go on, and I will trim that as necessary. Now I've marked up my 4 hinge points. Oh, where are we? Can we see that? So that's 1, 2, 3, 4. And I mark these up on the wing first. I then put a set square on and I've just put a line across where all of the hinge points are. And hopefully you can see that if I move the wing in. So we've got the same spacing, so these should marry up really nicely. So what we can do is we can, tell you what, let's have a look at the wing first. What I've then done on the wing, just move this around, is I've marked a centre line down the centre of this aileron bay, this trailing edge. Now it's not enough just to mark the crosses and the centre line. It's really important that we take a straight edge, a ruler, and we make sure when we're marking them up that these are exactly in line. And hopefully you can see there, all these hinges are in line. If we have our hinges offset in relation to each other, then as they bend, it's going to be putting force that we don't want onto the hinges to make them operate. So they need to be in directly straight line. Now, okay, we'll do the ailerons first, and if we look through the wing, the hole on the hole centering jig, we can actually see our pencil mark. Hopefully you can see that, and you can line that up centrally. Now once we've got that, hold it nice and tight. We've got our drill with our depth stop, and we need to drill this as square as possible. And now that has given us our 3mm hole, and we can see, just line it up, hopefully that's nice and central. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to counter bore that. So I'm going to put in my 4mm drill with a depth stop, and I'm just going to by eye get this straight and just drill that. Right, now we have that counterboard. I don't know whether that shows up any difference, but what I'm going to do then is take my first drill and just make sure I've got all of the frass, the shavings, out of the hole, so it's nice and clear to allow the hinge to go in. And there we go, the hinge fits in there nice and snug, and we can see operates quite nicely. Now to get this out, this is going to be quite tight, so we hold the pin and we just give it a little bit of a wiggle, just holding the pin. I really don't like the idea of pulling the hinge itself. There we go. So it's still quite a tight hole. Now I'm going to get on and do the rest of these. So we'll get all 4 of these done, and then we'll come back and have a look at doing the holes in the actual wing itself. Right, well, I've got all of the holes drilled in the aileron now, so I'm going to put that aside and drill the holes in the wing or in the wing trailing edge. And I've put on a collet, like a wheel collet, on this drill to act as a depth stop, so I don't go out the back of these pieces of balsa here. I don't over drill it, like I said earlier, and lose my glue, but it's still deep enough that it'll drill a full-sized hole for the hinge. But I'm not going to, as I said, I'm not going to be using the wing jig, so I need to take extra care, or the hole centering jig. So I need to take extra care to get these holes just nice and central. So I'm going to line that up and look at it from the side, and we'll drill through. There we go, and we haven't come out the back, which is nice, and fits in, so we just now need to counterbore it. So we'll take out that, put in the slightly bigger drill, and as with the ailerons, just a very slight bit of counterboring will allow the hinge to go in correctly. There we go. Now that goes in and sits lovely and square on there. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to drill the rest of the holes, and then we'll fit the aileron and we'll see how it looks. Right, well, I've now got all of the holes drilled for the left hand side of the wing, and I've put in the pins, and I'll just see if I can line that up just to show they're all in a really straight line. And that is, as I said, really important so we don't cause any stress on the aileron or the hinges. Now we've got the holes in the aileron, this is the one, and we'll just put this on and see how it fits. Just move the wing over. Careful pressing this down evenly. Right, now we've got this aileron pushed on pretty tightly at the moment, but we can see that if I just make sure this is on properly. There. Now this works lovely. Nice smooth surface. Yeah, there's a bit of friction. You know, we've got the 4 hinges, but it's lovely and smooth, and everything is dead straight in line. But if we turn this around, we can see, just see if I can move that a little bit closer. We can see there's quite a big gap between the trailing edge there, the aileron bay, and the actual aileron itself. So what we're going to do is I'm going to profile this leading edge here, put a couple of angles on it so that it will rotate nicely when we move it closer, and I'm going to put some crescent moons or half circles in that edge on the on the aileron, and that will allow it to get closer and be a much better fit in the end. So I'm going to do that now. I'm going to profile it and do those crescents, and we'll come back and we'll see how it's such a better fit once we've done that. Right, well, I've profiled the back of that aileron now, and I've just put some sort of 45-degree angles, so that, as you would do with any aileron, whether you're hinging it with Robarts or Mylar hinges, and so it doesn't catch as it rotates in the back of the aileron bay. And as I said, I've put in these kind of half round scallops, and the reason I've done that is because it allows the hinge to sit down further into the aileron, and by doing that it allows us to get much closer join between the back of the aileron and the trailing edge of the wing. And I'll put this together and just show you the effect that has, having seen it the other way. Just one quick comment: when I drill the 3mm hole, then the 4mm hole, and you could ask yourself, why not just drill 4mm and be done with it and just have one hole? Well, if you push this into the 3mm hole like that, it doesn't wobble, it stays where it is. Now if we were to put a 4mm hole in, then there's still quite a lot of wiggle in that hinge, and if we had just the 4mm hole, when we epoxy them into the wing or the elevator, then or the aileron, whatever the control surface is, if we have a 4mm hole, they could end up being off a straight line, whereas having the 3mm hole, as long as we drill it right, we end up with a line of hinges that are held directly in line, and they won't move off that when it's gluing. So it's always good to have that smaller hole to hold the hinge properly. Now I'll just push this together and we'll see what it looks like. Right, well, you can see from this straight away it's a much closer join between the aileron and the aileron bay, and because of the chamfering on the back, we've still got a good, turn that around, a good degree of movement. Plenty for what we need. Now those half rounds, we could make them bigger so we can get an even tighter join, but to be honest, once the covering's on, I think that will be absolutely fine for what we want. So we've got this far. This is the first stage that we needed to do, and we need to do this with all of our control surfaces. And then the second stage is when we've got the plane finished and covered, and we'll come back and glue these. So I'm going to get on and do that now, and then we'll have a look and see how we glue them in. Right, I've now got this wing covered, but there's one last thing I need to do before we install these hinges. Now I've got the ailerons to cover, but rather than just going ahead now and covering them, I'm going to first reacquaint myself with the holes for the hinges. So I could put in the hinges just roughly into the aileron like this. I can then offer the aileron up to the wing, to the trailing edge, the aileron bay, and that will help me identify where those holes are in the wing that I've just covered up. Now, rather than just getting a scalpel or a knife and pushing through and cutting a bit of a ragged, jagged hole, or even trying to cut a nice neat hole, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a soldering iron, and I'm going to use a nice hot soldering iron, and I'm just going to, it's quite a fine iron, and it will just push into the hole and it will melt the covering and just create a nice round hole, nothing jagged that might start splitting with time. So I'm going to do that now, and then we'll get those ailerons covered, and then we can install the hinges. Now there's one last thing we need to do before we actually glue the hinges into place, and that is getting the hinges and just putting a little bit of Vaseline into the hinge joint itself, so that it will prevent any glue going in, possibly if it spills out the hole. Hopefully it won't. And then once we've got that Vaseline in, we need to clean it up. And this is how I do it. So first we just melt the Vaseline and get it so it's nice and runny, so it goes into the centre of the hinge joint. And then we just fold it as far as it will go, dunk it in, fold it round again, and then dunk it in. It's not necessarily about getting the Vaseline on the outside of the hinge, it's more about trying to get it right into the middle. So that's what we do, and then just put it like that for it to dry. Right, well, I've been quite careful to just get the Vaseline around that hinge point. Hopefully you can see there's not too much coming down, but what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to take a bit of tissue and wipe off the excess, and being careful not to get it down onto the gluing surface further down onto the barbs. So I'm just putting that in and giving it a little bit of a twist, and if there's any big lumps like that, then it serves no purpose really. So there we go, that's the one. Now, one of the things I keep doing is changing the tissue quite a lot, because the last thing I want to do is start rubbing these with a Vaseline soaked, impregnated tissue and end up putting the Vaseline on the barbs. If it's on this section here, that's not so much of a problem, because the main gluing area is going to be where the barbs are. And the last thing I'm going to do with this now is just take some, this is 240 grit paper, and I'm just going to put in the barbs and the end and just give it a quick rotate, just to roughen it up a little bit, and hopefully if there's any Vaseline on that, it'll just get rid of it. Right, well, we've now got all of the hinges with a Vaseline impregnated into that joint, so hopefully any epoxy that strays out of the hole won't go into that joint and start to stiffen it up, which is the last thing we want. Now I'm going to be gluing the hinges in with some 30-minute epoxy. That will give us not only plenty of time to get the glue in the hole and to get the hinge into the correct position, but if any does spill out, or we need to take a hinge out and put another one in for some reason, it gives us a little bit of time to play with. We're not rushing as if we would be with, say, 5-minute epoxy. Now, to get the glue into the hole, we're going to be using a 10mm syringe, and it's got a blunt 14 gauge needle. Now, that needle is a good size to get in the hole, so we can inject the glue to the bottom of the hole. So if that's the hole, we can put it in to the bottom and then slowly bring it out as we squeeze in glue in. But we need to be really careful that we don't put too much in. And from experience, I would say about 1 or 2 mils. So it's only a little bit, because at the end of the day, the hole is quite a tight fit for these hinges anyway. So we just need enough glue to surround them and hold them in place and to soak into the balsa to get into those barbs. Now I'm going to turn the plane up on its tail. Now we can see we've got the holes that we've burnt in ready to accept the hinges, and we're going to be using our syringe. So we'll put it into the hole and we'll squeeze the glue in, working our way out. Now once we've done that, we can just press the hinge in like this, with the hinge at a 90-degree angle like that, and we'll push it in as far as it will go. There we go. So, but what we need to do is we need to make sure that that is totally 90 degrees to the tail plane, not like that. So we just need to put a little bit of a twist on that. There we go. Hopefully that will show up on the camera, and then when the elevator is operating, it is nice and smooth because it's totally in plane with the tailplane. If it's like this at an angle, we're obviously going to have problems trying to operate an elevator that's connected to that. So once we've got those, the reason we're doing it in the tailplane and the rudder, and we'll do it in the wing first, is because we can just push that in to the full depth and we know that that is correct. Now, I've just moved the fuselage and I will show you what we do next. Right, well, once we have all of the hinges glued in place, the glue's gone off, we will use our syringe again to put the glue into the hole coming out so we get full coverage of the hole. So you saw a little bit of dust come out there, so I'll just blow that out. And then once we've got the glue in the hole, we'll just slide this home, carefully doing all 6 at the same time, getting it nice and even, and then we can just close this up until we get the correct gap between the tailplane and the elevator, and then we can just leave it to dry. But what I'll do is I'll put some epoxy on the side, and I will just make sure as that's starting to stiffen up, the epoxy on the side, that this is still moving and that we haven't got any glue into the hinge. I've now got these 3 hinges in and they're nice and square to the tailplane, which is great. And you'll notice I put just a little bit of epoxy on the barbs, not a lot, just to coat the barbs before I push them in the hole. And as I was pushing the hinge in, I got to the last 1 or 2 millimeters, 1/16 of an inch, something like that, and then the epoxy just started to squeeze out of the hole, and I just used a little bit of tissue to wipe that up before finally pushing it home to where it needs to be. And having that little bit of epoxy comes out is kind of reassuring in a way, because it shows that we've got the hole full and the hinge itself, the barbs, surrounded by glue. So I'm going to get on and do these other 3 now on the right hand side of the tailplane. Incidentally, earlier when I said about putting a little bit of epoxy on the side to see when it's starting to go hard, I didn't mean on the side of the hinges or the plane. I meant just my mixing pad, so I can tell when it's starting to go off, so I can just check I can still move these. So I'm going to get the others glued in. Right, well, the epoxy now is cured and these hinges are still moving freely, which is good. So the next job is to mix up some more epoxy and put it in all 6 holes, line up the hinges, and we can slide on the elevator, and we'll make sure we do that nice and consistent so we get a good gap along here, so the 2 are parallel. We don't want it too tight, we don't want it too loose. Now, just as a small aside, the syringe and needle that I've been using, I've got some 95% alcohol in here, and you can just flush it out, and it just, oops, let's just try that. Yeah, there we go. You can just flush it out a few times with the 95% alcohol, and then you can use the syringe again. So we don't have to keep replacing the syringe and needle, which is good. Right, well the epoxy now has cured on the elevator and that is lovely and smooth, and you can see it's dropping under its own weight, which is great. So there's very little resistance there, and I think once it's had a little bit more use, that'll become even freer as the hinges bed in. And also we've still got, don't forget, some of that Vaseline in there, but that is lovely and I'm really pleased with that. It's gone on really nice and it's just a very consistent, smooth hinge. So I'm going to draw this video to a close now, but hopefully that has helped you if you're thinking about using Robart hinges. They are great hinges, they're really strong. They take a little bit more work to install than say Mylar hinges, but you do get that lovely free hinge movement, which is really strong. So anyway, thanks very much for watching and I hope you found that useful.